Anything about hear about the War of 1812?
A little?
A little bit. The War of 1812 was actually a continuation and a part of the war between the French and the English in Europe, and then it spilled over into America. The British at that time had control of all of Canada. And in 1814, the British had amassed a huge force of soldiers and a flotilla of ships. And their whole purpose was to come down Lake Champlain, get control of Lake Champlain so they could cut off New England from the rest of the states. They wanted to divide the United States so that they could claim, when they stopped the war, they could claim New England as Canadian territory. It didn't happen. They lost the battle. But anyway, the battle was fought right out there. You see the lake right in the bay. So this house sits right on the edge. You could see the battle from right here. The people knew that the British were coming. This is a map of it. The British were coming down from Canada. This is the house that all the people in Plattsburgh, all the way through here and through here, this whole territory, the people left because they knew the British were going to take over their houses. So the people left here and went, the wife had left early and went to Saratoga. The other went to Peru, New York. And the British had a contingent of junior artillery officers stationed in the house here because they were building all these little embankments here where they had the cannons that they were firing on. The Americans were all on this side of the river. Now, there was a separate, these are the Army. They also had the Navy out here in the bay fighting, and that was the most important battle. And right from the get-go, the first volley of cannons back and forth, the Americans killed the commander of the British forces, and it only took a few more hours for the British to strike their colors and surrender and so on. So the land forces knew that the whole purpose was to get control of the lake. They weren't going to do that, so they might as well go back to Canada. So they just they just turned tail and hightailed it back up across the border. Now, since they had been in the house, there was some damage, minor damage of guys in here that didn't care about things. There were pock marks on the railing where their sword cases hit. And the sideboard here, which was one of Betsy's prized possessions because it's made out of mahogany, they tried to get in it. See, there's keyholes and it was locked, so they dug in. Now, this is a recreation of it because they broke the door. And she was really mad because you couldn't get mahogany anymore. The trade was cut off for years, so it had to be replaced. So they replaced it to look like they had, gotten in. But the British had left one thing, and that's this mess chest. British officers their group always traveled with a chest where they kept their teacups and saucers and sugar and all that good stuff, the tea. And this was here. They had to hurry up and get back, so they just couldn't carry it. And so that has become kind of a prized possession since 1814 when the Delords got back to the house and had to regroup after the war. Okay, now that's what the house is we usually hear people want to talk about the house. Its connection to the War of 1812 and the Battle of Plattsburgh. But this house served one family for over 100 years, for over a century. And the various 3 generations of the family contributed to the development of not only Plattsburgh, but the whole country. So let's come in here and I'll introduce you to the family. The first generation of Delords was Henry Delord here and his wife Betsy, who had one daughter. Henry was an immigrant from France via the Caribbean. He had gone to the Caribbean, developed a plantation, but the French Revolution kind of put a squash on that, and he was more or less forced out. The British took over the island. They wouldn't let him go back to France because he could join the army and fight against the British there. So the only place he could come was America. And he ended up in New York City. He made his way north to Peru, New York, and he started a store there. He started over again because he had practically nothing. Started over again, became very successful there. But, excuse me, Peru, New York. Are you from the area?
My wife was born and raised here. I'm originally from Dutch and Columbia County.
Okay, so you know a little bit?
A little bit, yeah.
Okay, so Peru, you know where Peru is, just a little ways south. They had a Quaker settlement there. He set up a business, a store, became very successful. He was the postmaster there. He became both a claims court judge and a county judge and claims court judge. Very successful. He was very ambitious. He met a young girl there. She was not part of the Quaker settlement. Her mother had a bakery business. And he fell in love with her, and they got married. She was 15, he was 35. That's not unusual for the time period. Older men marrying younger women. Longer time period to have kids. But they only had one child, their daughter, Frances Henrietta. Now, he was very successful in Peru, but found that most of his time was spent here in Plattsburgh. So he decided to move here. And he was looking for a place to live in Plattsburgh. And he found this little 1.5 room cabin. That hallway and that room that we'll see last are the original house, which is the oldest house in Plattsburgh, built in 1797. He bought it from Elizabeth Kent owned it, but at the time period, women could not sell their property. They could own it, but they couldn't sell it. So her husband had to sign the bill of sale, and his name was James Kent. He became a chancellor of New York State, which is like a Supreme Court judge. He was a very important lawyer. He wrote a very famous law book. I don't know if it's still in use, but it's still in existence. So his business was in Albany. They didn't need this little cabin that her brother had given her. He's the one that had it built. And so they sold it to Henry for $850, which was quite a bit at that time, but it included 3 acres of land, all the land around here. It's interesting also to note that when the judge, was going to sign the bill of sale, they called it an indenture then, he made Elizabeth Kent, who actually owned the property, he asked her to sign the bill of sale saying she wasn't forced by her husband to sell it. So
avoid problems later on.
Right, well, yeah, but one of the things I find with a lot of the women of this house is they're very progressive for the time period. A lot of them are more socially conscious, social activists than you would find in other time periods, and accepted for it. But anyway, that's why this place is called the Kent-Delord house. The Kents never lived here, but he was more famous than Henry Delord in the scheme of things in New York State. So when they were calling this a museum, they said, well, everyone will know James Kent. now no one knows James Kent.
How long has it been a museum?
It's been a museum since, officially, since 1928. It's been a museum since about probably 1918, 1919, unofficially, that the people began charging people to come in just to raise money so they could upkeep the place. But anyway, they had one daughter, Frances Henrietta. Now, because of Henry's good graces during the Battle of Plattsburgh, he let soldiers buy in his store. He had a store in that corner.
I was reading that plaque out there.
Yes, he let them buy on credit with the understanding that the generals that asked him to do it said that the government would pay the soldiers or repay him. They never did. All right, so after the Battle of Plattsburgh, Henry's creditors start going after he and his partner, William Bailey. They split the partnership. They have to close the store. He's still fighting his creditors. And in 1816, one creditor's really hounding him. He had lawyers, including Kent, working to, get his satisfy his creditors. And this one guy wouldn't be satisfied, so they had a sheriff's sale. They sold the house and a lot of his personal property in that sheriff's sale. But there was a friend of Henry's that bought most of it, including the house. And he let Henry and his wife and daughter live here. I think it was like $1 a year or whatever. 2 years later, after buying the house, he deeded it over to Betsy, his wife, and his daughter, Frances Henrietta, so that it was theirs in name. The creditors couldn't go after the house. But Henry died in 1825, and they had another sheriff's sale. This time, Betsy was responsible for all his debts. And by agreement in the community, when the sheriff asked for the first bid, no one would put in a bid. They allowed Betsy to buy her house back for $18.73. So that's how the Delords were seen in the community. They were very well respected. All right, so Henry dies in 1825. Betsy and Frances Henrietta are here trying to, figure out how they're going to get by and make a living. And she rents out half the house to this family, Mr. and Mrs. Lawrence Myers. Mrs. Myers' brother-in-law was one of the lawyers that had helped Henry out at one time, William Swetland. And he was a widower himself with 2 young daughters. They ended up marrying 4 years after Henry died. All right, moved into the house that's now Betsy's free and clear. So anyway, we fast forward to, she's about 6 or 7 in that portrait that was done in 1818. In 1832, she's 18 years old and she's going to get married.